Well, the book tackles 400 years of history in 500 pages, and now I want to cover 500 pages in 15 minutes, so we're going to have to move very quickly. Let me begin with this slide from something called A Plan for a Really Greater New York. Now, it was published in 1914 at a time when New York's economic prospects were declining, and you can see there that the idea was to reclaim about 50 square miles of open water in New York Harbor. One supporter of the plan said, and I really love this quotation, "We cannot have too much of New York City." Underlying that quote is the assumption of New York as a limitless proposition. The idea that New York can grow and grow in terms of its population, its land values, and its relations with land and sea. I call this idea the growth imperative. That idea is enormously influential, in my view, is the key to understanding New York's ecological history. And it's in evidence today in plans that still are popping up for filling in the Harlem River, building elaborate land bridges out from lower Manhattan, absorbing Governor's Island, this kind of thing. So we can sit around, I suppose, and all debate the merits or not of this kind of approach, this kind of growth, and reasonable people can, of course, disagree. But rather than do that, what I want to do with you today is examine where this idea came from. That's a historical question, and answering it will help to show that the idea wasn't etched in stone, and that it can be changed. Along the way, I'll discuss some of the on-the-ground impacts of the growth imperative, and I'll end with a couple of reflections on the limits to growth as I see them. So let me take a first stab at this question of origins and suggest to you that the genesis of the growth imperative rested on three historical developments I'd like to speak about very briefly with you here today. One is the creation of a market in underwater land in the latter part of the 17th century, the grid plan of 1811, and then the third thing I want to talk about is the formal articulation of the growth imperative during an interesting time during New York's storm history. Okay, so let's talk about the market in underwater land. As it turns out, New York has been thumbing its nose at the sea for about 300 years. The Dutch, it's true, built a canal down what is today Broad Street in lower Manhattan. But it was actually the British who took a much more aggressive approach to relations with both land and sea. And I say this because of a 1686 charter whereby the Crown granted to the corporation of the city of New York title to land underwater extending to the low water mark. Then the Crown, 45 years later, went a step further and granted to the city title to land underwater extending 400 feet beyond the low water mark, extending around the southern part of Manhattan Island. The Brits, in other words, created a market in underwater land. They transformed land underwater into a commodity, into something that could be bought and sold just like anything else. And then the city of New York turned around and doled out these so-called water lots, as they called them, to the merchant elite and to well-off artisans, who then proceeded to fill in the water and expand the size of Manhattan. The idea was to bulk up the island and thereby create more linear feed of waterfront. Waterfront was, of course, the premier resource in a port city that had hitched its economic hopes to maritime commerce. Historians have known for a long time that the European colonists carried with them to North America the idea of private property, the idea that land could be used as a tool for accumulating capital. But what happened in New York under the British was that they went a step further, which is to say that they showed that land wasn't even a fixed resource, that more of it could be made. Thus, the seeds of limitless growth were sown, a vision that helped to underwrite the expansion of New York at the expense of the sea, and this is where I get the title for the book, Gotham Unbound. Let me now turn to the grid plan of 1811. The grid is probably the most famous expression of New York's urbanity. Lots of ink has been spilled about it. And yet, it's not often realized that the grid was shaped by a desire to expand into the sea. Indeed, and you can see here in this slide from 1802, which is a full 9 years before the actual grid plan itself was published, you can see that the grid there is being superimposed across the waterfront in order to rationalize it, in order to facilitate the sale of those water lots that I just finished telling you about. Again, this is 9 years before the actual formal grid plan was, as some would say, slapped down across the interior part of the island. Secondly, the enabling legislation that led to the appointment of the street commissioners, who of course signed off on the grid plan in 1811, that enabling legislation actually included within it further expansion of New York's underwater estate. This time it wasn't the Crown, of course, that was doing the granting to the city of New York. It was the state of New York that was doing so. The key point, the point I want to underline with you here is that the grid paved the way, as most people know, for lots of people on Manhattan Island, but also for growth at the expense of growth on low-lying ground. The grid, in other words, united the ideas of hyperdensity and expansion into the surrounding waters. Now, New York succeeded as a port, spurred on by the completion of the Erie Canal in 1825. Its manufacturing took off. It eventually evolved into the financial center of the world. The population, meanwhile, surpassed the million mark in the 1870s. All this very well known. Less well known, and I apologize for my clunky graphics, less well known is that in 1821, there was a hurricane that barreled through Newark, New Jersey, and placed New York City on the dangerous right side of the storm because of the rotation of the storm, creating a storm surge. It's estimated, an estimated storm surge at the Battery of 10 to 11 feet, which, if true, would have outstripped the storm surge in Hurricane Sandy. That was 9.4 feet. It was an intense storm that destroyed wharves throughout greater New York and flooded the southern part of Manhattan as far north as Canal Street. At the time, New York City was the largest city in the nation, it's true, but compared to where New York would ultimately end up, the city was relatively small, only about 125,000 people. Well, if you think about it, if the 1821 hurricane had happened 50 years later, the destruction would have likely been monumental. New York's history would have unfolded, of course, differently, and I dare say the idea of coastal flooding would be much more at the forefront of the city's collective consciousness. Instead, and this is why I brought this slide with me here to show you today, New York entered a kind of very quiet period in terms of major storms. If you can see, and I don't know how well you can see, I'm nearly blind myself, but between, after 1821, another major storm like that doesn't strike New York until 1888. That's the great blizzard that many of you have probably heard about. Well, during this period of storm quiescence, a lot of things happened, but two I want to underline for you. One is that real estate was modernized, and what I mean by that was that there was the rise of an institutional scaffolding here, beginning in the 1850s and 1860s. Real Estate Trade Journal, the Real Estate Records and Builders Guide, real estate sales rooms, or sales room, real estate auctions, these sorts of things are all taking off during this period of storm quiescence. And the other thing that is happening during this period, and the primary reason that I'm telling you about this, is that people in real estate and other New York boosters began to make the argument that New York City's genius lay in its phenomenal capacity for constantly increasing population and land values. In other words, the formal idea of the growth imperative was born. Now let me turn to talk a little bit about the impact of the growth imperative on the ground itself. Its significance, as I indicated earlier, was immense, especially so in the 20th century, and particularly in the region's marshlands. There's a credible estimate that in 1900, it's actually 1904, so not that long ago, I'm talking here around the time my grandparents were being born, and I'm not that old, there were within a 25-mile radius of the city of New York in Manhattan about 300 square miles of wetland, or an area about a quarter the size of the state of Rhode Island. So 1900, turn of the century, New York City was a big city located in what a lot of people would consider to be a swamp, really a network of tidal wetlands, which were teeming with plant and animal life, and Eric can tell you a lot more than I can about that. They filtered these wetlands impurities from the water, they trapped sediment, and they also acted as a buffer during storms. Well, here's the thing. Over the next 80 years, between 1900 and 1980 or so, these wetlands throughout the New York metropolitan area were reduced to a shadow of their former selves. And this is just, I focus in here for you on Jamaica Bay, an example of what happened in Jamaica Bay. In 1900, what you see up there in the upper left panel, it's about 25 square miles of wetland there in 1900. 2010, it's a little over 3 square miles that are left. The wetlands were filled in or destroyed, disappeared to make way for Floyd Bennett Field, New York's first municipal airport on the western end of the bay. On the eastern end of the bay, of course, Kennedy Airport, where Eric just came from. Roads, parks, landfills, of course, and there were also, we now know, obscure natural processes that all were ushering the marshes down the road to oblivion, you might say. Well, it turns out that what happened in Jamaica Bay was not by any means unique. It was going on all throughout greater New York, and here I've totaled up some of the marshland complexes that I've looked at in some detail, apart from Jamaica Bay and Staten Island, Fresh Kills and Great Kills, Flushing Meadows, and of course the monumental Hackensack, Newark, and Elizabeth Meadowlands, which were 42 square miles in extent, according to my calculations, as late as 1900. All of them, in total at least, reduced, as you can see from this table, by 80%. Well, given the embattled history of New York's historic wetlands, I have to say, this is the polemic part, that I was a bit underwhelmed by the more recent transformation of the growth imperative into a form of environmentalism. What's going on with that? Well, let me tell you. First of all, in principle, and this has been known for a long time, cities have enormous energy efficiencies, and they can indeed address climate change. Because they have lower per capita carbon emissions than rural areas. People in hyperdense Manhattan, where there's 69,000 people per square mile, they walk to work, they take public transit, they live in apartments with shared walls, and in terms of their per capita carbon emissions, yes, they're doing more good for the world, you might say, than somebody living in a shack in Vermont eating organic food and driving 150 miles to get a cap on their tooth or something like that. But to go and say that hyperdensity is an environmental strategy, which the Bloomberg administration began doing, beginning at least, certainly by 2007, and other New York boosters have made this argument. To call hyperdensity growth an environmental strategy is stretching it a bit. Here's why. Global warming is hardly the only ecological problem that New York, much less the world, faces. Yes, dense cities like New York can address global environmental change, but they also create a number of problems that need to be thought about as well. Habitat loss, you saw the wetland transformation that I just alluded to. Nutrient pollution, which robs oxygen from the water, and compromises biodiversity in the process. And then, lest I add, coastal flooding is yet a third problem that are created by hyperdense cities. And I want to just end then, with this map. That's my last slide of hurricane evacuation zones in New York. It was published by the New York City Office of Emergency Management in 2013, or maybe even 2014, I'm not sure which. The 6 zones are home to about 3 million New Yorkers. And I calculated out the land area of the 6 zones themselves. And this is something apparently the city of New York doesn't like to advertise because it was very difficult to figure this out. It turns out the 6 zones encompass 147 square miles, which is nearly half the entire land area of the city of New York, all of which is at risk, according to New York's emergency managers, of needing to be evacuated in the event of coastal flooding. Rising sea level around New York is only going to aggravate this situation, of course. The mid-range prediction is that there's going to be 11 to 24 inches of rise in sea level in the waters surrounding New York by the 2050s. Just to put the 11 to 24 figure in perspective for you, between the 1850s and the present, there was somewhere on the order of about 1.5 feet of sea level rise. So now we're talking about potentially a rise in sea level that's going to outstrip what happened over that long period of time in a mere 35 years. Meanwhile, another projection is that the city will add 800,000 people by 2040. 800,000 would be about the size of Amsterdam in the Netherlands, as new housing rises up in vacant industrial zones along the East River waterfront in what I take to be Hurricane Evacuation Zone 1, the riskiest evacuation zone. I think it's fair to say that the growth imperative is alive and well and living in New York. As the Bloomberg administration said in its formal response to Hurricane Sandy, the city cannot and will not retreat. Thank you.